It all happened in the blink of an eye. A young black girl, just walking down the street, suddenly finds herself under attack. A racist cop, fueled by hate, grabs her and sets her hair on fire. But just as the flames begin to burn, something incredible happens. Her father, the chief of police, walks around the corner, ready to change everything. What happens next will shock you and leave you questioning the system itself. It was an ordinary afternoon for 13-year-old Maya. She had just finished her day at school and was walking home, earbuds in, humming along to her favorite song. She was still a child, innocent and carefree, not expecting any trouble. The neighborhood was familiar, a place she'd walked through 1,000 times, but today, something felt off. As Maya passed a group of officers standing near the corner, one of them, Officer Collins, stared at her in a way that sent an unsettling chill down her spine. Maya didn't know much about him, but the rumors about his temper and racial bias were enough to make anyone nervous. She quickened her pace, hoping to get past without incident. But the officer's glare followed her every step. Then, without warning, Officer Collins grabbed her by the arm, his grip strong and unforgiving. "What are you doing here?" he sneered, pulling her closer. Before she could protest, he took out a lighter and set her hair on fire, the flames quickly spreading. But Maya wasn't alone. Her father, Chief of Police Anthony West, was just a few blocks away, and what happened next would change everything. The pain was unlike anything Maya had ever felt before. The flames from Officer Collins' lighter scorched her hair, and she could feel the heat travel through her scalp. She screamed, but the officer only laughed, his cruel eyes watching her as the fire spread. She tried to swat at her head, but the flames burned hotter and fiercer. Maya felt helpless, trapped in a nightmare she never imagined. She had no idea what was happening, how this was happening. She had been walking home from the park, minding her own business. Now she was burning. It was happening so fast, but the whole world felt like it was moving in slow motion. The agony was almost unbearable, and her knees began to buckle beneath her. She could barely breathe with the smoke filling the air, the stench of burning hair suffocating her senses. Officer Collins, a man known for his racist reputation, didn't flinch. He stood there with an almost satisfied look, enjoying the sight of her pain. "You should know your place," he said mockingly. "Maybe this will teach you some respect." Maya's heart was racing, and as the fire continued to burn, she thought of one thing: her father. Chief of Police Anthony West was the one person she could always count on, the one person who had always protected her. But now, as she stood there fighting against the searing heat, would he even be able to help her in time? Tears blurred her vision as the flames kept creeping up. Why wasn't anyone helping? The street was quiet, and the only sounds were her screams and the officer's taunting laughter. Maya felt an overwhelming sense of fear. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she would survive this, but fate had other plans. At that moment, Maya's father, Chief of Police Anthony West, came driving down the street, his instincts kicking in as he recognized the scene. He had received a call just moments earlier about an incident involving his daughter. His heart raced in panic. He pushed the accelerator, his mind consumed with fear for Maya. The chief knew he had to act fast. He couldn't lose his daughter like this. He turned the corner just in time to see Officer Collins still standing over Maya, who was now on her knees, her hair smoking. The flames were still burning, and Collins hadn't moved to help. In fact, he looked entertained, his face twisted with satisfaction. But then he saw something that made him freeze. The chief of police, his superior, was approaching fast. Anthony West's car screeched to a halt and he rushed out, not giving Collins any time to react. His eyes locked on his daughter, and the fury that built up inside him was like a storm ready to unleash. Seeing Maya in pain, watching her helplessly burning under the hands of a cop, it was a feeling he couldn't describe. Every fiber of his being screamed to protect her, to stop this madness before it went any further. "Get your hands off her!" Anthony roared, his voice filled with authority and anger. It wasn't just the anger of a father. It was the anger of a man who had spent years upholding justice, only to see it so easily corrupted by hate. Officer Collins took a step back, his earlier confidence wavering. His eyes flicked nervously at the chief, and he tried to regain his composure. But it was clear that the chief's arrival had shifted the balance. The same man who had felt untouchable was now facing the full force of authority, and he wasn't prepared for it. Anthony quickly knelt beside Maya, pulling her away from the officer. He cradled her head, his protective instincts overwhelming him as he tried to assess the damage. The flames were gone, but her hair had been severely damaged. The pain in her eyes hit him harder than any physical injury could. This was more than just a burn. This was an assault on his daughter's dignity, her humanity, and he wouldn't stand for it. The moment Anthony West set eyes on the scene, everything shifted. The sight of his daughter, trembling and still on her knees, tears streaming down her face, ignited something deep inside him. It wasn't just the professional responsibility he felt as a chief of police. It was the overwhelming, primal urge of a father who had just witnessed his child in pain, humiliation, and fear. His heart pounded in his chest as he rushed towards her. His voice echoed through the air. "Get away from my daughter!" It was a command, not a plea, as though his very presence could alter the course of what was happening. For a split second, Officer Collins froze, his eyes wide with realization that the man standing in front of him wasn't just any civilian. It was the chief of police, the very authority he had been ignoring and undermining. Maya looked up as she saw her father's face, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and fear. Her heart skipped a beat, knowing that he was here, right in front of her, and the weight of the moment began to settle in. She had been burning under the hands of this man, a cop who had sworn to protect people like her. Yet here he was, trying to destroy her. Officer Collins didn't know how to react. He stammered, trying to come up with something to defend himself, but his words faltered. The laughter that had once spilled from his lips now seemed forced and pathetic. I was just doing my job," he muttered weakly, though his tone lacked any real conviction. The heat from his earlier actions had cooled, replaced by the realization that he was out of his depth. "Your job?" Anthony's voice rang with authority, the words cutting through the tension. "Your job is to protect, not to terrorize. You've crossed a line that you will never come back from." There was no hesitation in his words, no doubt in his mind. The moment he saw his daughter in danger, his resolve hardened. Officer Collins took a small step back, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat fully. He squared his shoulders, trying to stand tall. "What's the big deal? She's fine now. It's not like I—" Anthony interrupted, his anger boiling over. "Number, you don't get to dismiss this. You don't get to put your hands on my daughter and walk away like nothing happened. You've hurt her, and there will be consequences. There are no excuses for what you've done." With every word Anthony spoke, the grip of fear on Officer Collins grew tighter. He realized just how deep the hole he had dug for himself was. The chief wasn't just angry. He was the embodiment of justice, the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the system Collins represented. Anthony wasn't about to let this go. This wasn't a mere disagreement or an unfortunate situation. It was an attack. Maya's tears still streamed down her face, but now there was a different emotion rising within her. Relief. She wasn't just the victim anymore. Her father was here, standing tall, and he wasn't going to let her down. For the first time since the attack, Maya felt like she could breathe again. Anthony turned to her, his gaze softening, but his resolve never wavering. "Maya, are you okay? Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentler than before. But the pain in his eyes was undeniable. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. Before Maya could respond, Officer Collins tried one last time to salvage some shred of dignity. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She's just a kid. I had to do what was necessary." "You had to do what?" Anthony's voice was like ice. "What was necessary was for you to serve and protect her, not treat her like a criminal. You're the one who's wrong here, and you'll answer for it." The truth was undeniable now. Anthony had arrived at the moment of reckoning. The situation was no longer about a simple incident. It was about justice, about making sure that no one, especially someone in a position of power, could escape the consequences of their actions. As Collins stood there, his arrogance deflated, Anthony made it clear. This was not over. As Maya looked up at her father, she felt a mix of emotions. There was relief, yes, but also a lingering fear. Her father's arrival had stopped the immediate danger, but there was so much more at stake now. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something much deeper. The injustice that had been perpetuated in front of her could not be undone. But what Anthony didn't know was that this moment would expose more than just the racism of one officer. It would expose the cracks within the very system he had sworn to protect. The tension between Anthony and Officer Collins was palpable. But when the chief reached for his radio to report the incident, his face changed. The silence that fell over them was deafening. His hand shook as he held the mic, the weight of what he was about to do suddenly hitting him. He expected to call in the incident, to report a clear case of misconduct, but instead, a voice crackled through the radio that made his stomach drop. "Chief West, we need to talk, now." It wasn't the voice of his fellow officers. It was someone higher up, someone Anthony had always trusted. But now, hearing the urgency in their tone, he felt a gnawing dread. What could be worse than this? Before he could respond, the voice continued, "There's been an order from the top. No charges, no investigation. You're to handle this internally, understood?" Anthony froze, the words hitting him like a freight train. The shock washed over him, and for a moment, he didn't know how to react. How could they ask him to let this go? How could they tell him to cover up a blatant act of violence? It wasn't just Officer Collins who needed to answer for his actions. It was the system. The very system that had allowed this to happen, that had enabled officers like Collins to act without fear of retribution. "What do you mean?" Anthony's voice was sharp, but he was trying to steady himself. He wasn't just the father of a victim anymore. He was also a chief of police, a man who had sworn to uphold the law no matter the cost. "You heard me. Handle it. Internally." The voice on the radio was cold, impersonal. Anthony's grip on the mic tightened, his knuckles white. His instincts screamed at him to do the right thing, to make sure Collins was held accountable, to expose the systemic issues that allowed racism to thrive in the force. But now he was caught between duty and a harsh, uncomfortable truth. Maya, watching her father's reaction, could see it on his face, the conflict, the uncertainty. She could feel her own pulse racing as she realized what was happening. Her father wasn't just fighting for justice for her. He was fighting for his career, his position, and everything he believed in. Maya had always known her dad as a strong, upright man who stood for what was right. But in that moment, she realized that even someone like him could be tested in ways he hadn't prepared for. For the first time, Maya understood what it meant to challenge authority, to question the very system that had been designed to protect them. Her father's silence now spoke louder than any words ever could. She could see the weight of the decision on his shoulders. He was looking at her, and she knew what was going through his mind. This wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about something much bigger. It was about whether or not the system could ever truly be trusted. For Anthony, the revelation was clear now. There was no easy answer, no right path. If he chose to go against the orders, he risked everything. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for could be on the line. But as he looked at his daughter, still trembling from the trauma, something inside him clicked. Justice had to come first, no matter the cost. "I won't cover this up. Not now, not ever." His voice was firm, the decision made. He reached for his phone, ready to do whatever it took to expose the truth. The weight of what was to come wasn't lost on him, but he knew that sometimes standing for what's right meant risking it all. After everything that happened, things weren't the same. The shock waves from that day had rippled through the entire community, and the truth was out. Officer Collins had been removed from duty, and an investigation was underway. But that didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the pain Maya felt, nor did it erase the broken trust between her family and the very institution her father had spent his career building. Maya's scars ran deeper than the burns on her scalp. The fear she felt that day would stay with her for a long time. She couldn't shake the image of the officer standing over her, laughing as her hair caught fire, and the helplessness she felt in that moment. Her father's presence had saved her physically, but emotionally she was still struggling. Anthony, too, carried the weight of the experience. He had always believed in the system, trusted it to uphold justice and fairness. But when he saw the lengths his fellow officers were willing to go to protect someone like Collins, the truth was hard to ignore. The system had failed his daughter. It wasn't just a rogue officer. It was a deeper issue. Racism, hate, and bias had infected the very foundation of the institution he swore to protect. But standing in the middle of the chaos, Maya's tear-streaked face reminded Anthony of why he couldn't give up. He couldn't let the wrongs go unpunished. His daughter had been hurt, humiliated, but she had been brave. In the days that followed, Anthony made a promise to himself that things would change. He knew that his career might be on the line, but his family and the people he served were worth any sacrifice. Together, they became a symbol of the fight for justice. Anthony went public with everything: the investigation, the cover-up attempts, and the truth about how deeply ingrained the problem was within the police department. The media was relentless, but they couldn't ignore the fact that a young girl had been violently attacked by someone who should have been her protector. They couldn't ignore the role of her father, the chief, in making sure that justice was served. Maya struggled with her own sense of identity. Could she ever trust the system again? Could she see police officers as protectors, or would they always be the source of fear? It was hard to say. But she did know one thing: she wouldn't let this define her. She was stronger than she realized, and even though the road ahead was difficult, she had a renewed sense of purpose. She would fight for what was right, just as her father had. The incident sparked changes in the community. Protests were held, but they were different than others. These were peaceful, focused on bringing change rather than causing division. The town began to have hard conversations about race, power, and justice, and it was clear that the road to healing wouldn't be easy. But it had to start somewhere. For Anthony, the hardest part was looking at Maya and knowing that his own world had failed her. He had been in law enforcement his entire life, but now he was forced to confront the ugly truth about how deeply racism had crept into the system. And as much as he wanted to protect her from the harsh realities of the world, he realized that the best way to protect her now was to ensure things changed, to make sure no one else would ever experience what she did. Maya, though, had a different perspective. She didn't want sympathy or pity. She wanted change. She wanted to be the voice for other young girls like her who had been silenced for too long. The attack had taken away a piece of her innocence, but it had also given her a purpose. She was determined to make sure no one else suffered as she had. The journey wasn't over for either of them, but they had taken the first step. They had each other, and together they would fight for a world where justice was more than just a word. They were determined to ensure that no one else would have to endure what Maya had gone through. Maya's story didn't end with her father's arrival. It sparked a movement. Her bravery in the face of horror became a symbol for others who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. Her father, Chief of Police Anthony West, fought to make sure the truth came out. The system had failed his daughter, but he was determined to change it, to make sure that no child would ever have to endure what Maya did. Maya, though scarred, found strength. She became the voice of those who couldn't speak up, pushing for change, pushing for accountability. She understood now more than ever the power of speaking out, of standing up against hate, against injustice. And now it's your turn. What would you do if you were in Maya's shoes? Would you stand up against wrong, even when it seems impossible? Join the conversation. Drop a comment, share this story, and let's continue the fight for justice. Change doesn't happen if we stay silent. It's time to make sure that racism has no place in our world. Together, we can make a difference.